Hi, Zara. It's lovely to meet you. I'm Kaukab Stewart. I'm MSP for Glasgow Kelvin, and today I'm speaking to you from my constituency in Glasgow Kelvin. It's lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you as well. The privilege and pleasure is all mine.
So we're here today as part of Generations working together on International Women's Day, and obviously the celebrations going on across the world. So why do you think that it's important to celebrate International Women's Day?
Yeah, so I think I should first of all introduce myself to give a gist of my platform and advocacy as a young woman of colour in Australia. So my name is Zarah Al Hilaly, and I am a first generation Australian to refugee and migrant parents from Palestine and Iraq. I do quite a lot of advocacy on the grassroots and national level in Australia. I'm working across gender equality reforms, specifically regarding how we can adopt intersectional representation on the highest level of governance. Which reflects all the way down to grassroots levels. Fundamentally, to myself, I believe that International Women's Day is a great opportunity to reflect grassroots voices that unfortunately have not been platformed and amplified across spaces that don't traditionally reflect a variety of intersectional voices. International Women's Day acts as a beacon of hope for so many young women, especially young women of colour, to see themselves being represented and to speak out and speak loud of the opportunities and the grassroots advocacy that they do to essentially build back a world and build back that community of developing an equitable future.
You're so right there, Zara. Two words that sort of jumped out at me there is intersectionality, which is something that I've always tried to campaign on. I have the privilege, I suppose, of being the first woman of colour to be elected to the Scottish Parliament. But you might be aware that I first stood in 1999, actually. And to be honest, I didn't think that it would be me. I mean, about 5 or 6 years ago, I started mentoring and coaching and trying to bring on young women such as yourself to be the next generation. However, here we are, you know, did get elected. So the grassroots very much encouraging from the grassroots up. I think International Women's Day gives us an opportunity to sort of highlight role models. However, for some of us, we've not had those role models. So somebody of my age who has sort of coming through the system and has come through, I'm still on my journey. I didn't have the women of colour role models within politics, certainly, and actually education. I was a teacher for almost 30 years. And whilst there were lots of learning assistants that are teachers in schools rather, and teachers, what I didn't see was women in positions of leadership that were of colour, and yet teaching is female dominated. So it's interesting, you know, the work that you do on that advocacy and amplifying the voices on a world stage, I suppose. What challenges do you think that women face today? Because I'd be interested to hear that from your point of view.
Yeah, look, I think first of all, I do want to touch on the fact that in Australia, International Women's Day is almost over for us. And, you know, speaking to you about representation and diversity made me reflect on the day and what it looked like to many young Australian women of colour. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm disappointed this year once again for International Women's Day. And I think that that also extends to the challenges that we're facing within the gender equality advocacy space. Unfortunately, and I'm sure this is a global profound notion that is found in many Western countries, the gender equality space is predominantly led by white feminists. Completely disappointed this year, once again, to see the lack of representation being amplified within the highest spaces that celebrate gender equality today. And I think that today was meant to be a day for hope. It was meant to be a day where we amplify the most neglected constituents within the advocacy space. It's a space where we create room and we open those doors. But unfortunately, myself sitting here today, I'm once again disappointed by the lack of representation, which brings me to the next point of some of the challenges we're facing in the gender equality advocacy space. And that is fundamentally the lack of opportunities for intersectional women. Now that extends to intersectional young women all the way to intersectional old women. I think that unfortunately the gender equality advocacy space isn't as inclusive at the current moment. And I think that whilst reflecting about your own experiences, it worries me because I've only been in this space for 5 years and I've seen little progress. It is quite disappointing, to be frank, and I think that there is so much to do. And unfortunately, I'm slowly, and I often do challenge and struggle with that challenge of realizing that the World Economic Forum's statistic that gender equality won't be achieved in the next 99 years, unfortunately, might be true.
Yeah, I'm reflecting on what you said. I totally understand your disappointment, and it has been my eternal frustration as well. And when I reflect on why did it take 21 years to get the first woman of colour elected, why did that happen? And it's the multiple barriers and the intersectional barriers. What I found was that everyone else thought that everyone else was supporting me. Because I was female, the men, they guard their spaces, so it's difficult in politics anyway, and then the men carve those out, and that's that. And they just assumed that I would be getting support from women. The women saw me as a woman of colour, so they saw the race first, and they thought, well, she doesn't really necessarily need our support because she will get that from within her own communities. Whereas within my own communities, to have a Pakistani woman wanting to be in mainstream politics was actually for the reserve of men. So from every level, I really felt as though, I had fallen down the cracks in that way. And yes, so the expectations were never that I would ever succeed, that this was always going to be a campaigning issue. And don't get me wrong, there were points of that journey where I did feel like absolutely giving up, because I'll go back to the role model thing, is that just examples, cross-party as well as within many communities, was that there just wasn't anybody like me. And one of the things, I do have hope though, because I think, well, I'm now in a space, and that space for me is very much shared. And it's to make sure that I am that woman that, now that I've opened the door a little bit, because let's face it, you're right, it isn't wide open, absolutely no way. But now that it's opened a little bit, that the younger generations coming up behind don't have to wait 21 years, because frankly, the planet cannot afford that, let alone every other aspect of our sort of living. What's your opinion about sort of like, I'm sort of like, at 54, here I am being elected for the first time, and there's five-year parliamentary terms, and you being a young woman, how can intergenerational conversations help to speed up the process towards equal representation that is also intersectional?
Yeah, look, I think first and foremost, gender equality can't be achieved if we're not all a part of that revolution. Every single voice needs to be a part of that movement. And we can't complete it overnight with one specific identity, one specific demographic. We all need our own voice to be a part of that train, to push for that movement. And I think that intergenerational dialogue is a key factor to achieving that goal. I think young women come with so much innovation, so much new strategy, so much perspective. And I think on the opposing end, so do older feminists as well. For me, I think that this is a wonderful innovative platform that we can both profit off of to reach the common goal of achieving the end result, that revolution that we are after. I've been a part of so many intergenerational dialogues, and I always come out expecting, as a young woman, I am quite biased. I always come out expecting that I will gain the most from my fellow sisters who are like me, who hold the similar perspectives to myself. But I often shock myself because it is always a new adventure for myself to look for those new strategies that I can implement on the grassroots levels. I think that younger and older feminists definitely have paved the way for where I am today. But I also want to touch base on my ancestral knowledge that taps into my gender equality advocacy as well. For me, when I think of intergenerational dialogue, I also think about as far as my ancestors who aren't alive on this earth today. To me, the reason why I do what I do is because of the women that have come before me and have paved my journey here on this earth today. I am a proud Palestinian Iraqi young woman, and my mom, who is Palestinian, I hold a lot of my strength and courage and advocacy to her. She came from a fierce generation of advocates, fighting against colonization, fighting against the imperialism of their homes, of their culture. And I reflect on their strength and their courage from generations dating back to voices that I've never heard, voices that I've never met. And I think about those stories that I've passed on and have trickled through to my very own mother, who are now said to me today. That is why I am here. That is why I speak. That is why I fight. And I think that intergenerational dialogue cannot be, you know, the traditional, I'm speaking to you, you're speaking to me. It extends to the voices that are why we do what we do. They are our courage, they are our strength. And I think that intergenerational dialogue is not those that are living, it is those voices that, you know, have pushed us to continue to live.
Zara, that's such a sort of evocative way of looking at it, and that has certainly inspired me, you know, to sort of reflect on my space within that intergenerational conversation. I've often despaired in the past that, you know, we have had trailblazers sort of, you know, ahead of us, but yet we've made such little progress. So, you know, there is a disconnect there, and I do think that those conversations and the lessons and the mistakes, you know, quite clearly there are ways of campaigning, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear that, you know, I always think that education and, you know, stats and lived experiences underpin our arguments going forward, but also to sort of like, you know, to look at the past and the history of where we've come. But, you know, when I try to do research and things, and when you look up sort of inspirational women from the past, it's quite far down the research Google sort of agenda before you come across Black women. So it's actually, you know, the high hits are not, you know, you have to search quite hard. But nevertheless, you know, learning the lessons of the past, but taking stock of the present as well. And for me, certainly, the journey is hard and it continues to be difficult. So from that point of view, the hope and the drive and the ambition from the younger voices actually gives me more power to my elbow. And you're right about the innovation. I mean, social media is one of these things that certainly, you know, that's been drawn to my attention, to use that as a tool to amplify voices as well, which I necessarily wouldn't have considered in the past. But I suppose sort of like for our audiences that are out there, you know, listening to this, you know, the questions that come to my mind is what can be done to make that intergenerational dialogue more impactful? Because I do feel that we are speaking to each other and listening, but is that enough? What is the next step to actually, you know, not just be concerned about the inputs, but what are the outputs? You know, how can we actually make that change? Where are the pressure points that we are not managing to put our finger on? maybe that's something that we could sort of, food for thought in that sense. So do you think that, I mean, I said earlier that I'd opened the door a wee bit of a crack, and people refer to it as a glass ceiling, whereas I've often said that it's not just a glass ceiling, it's actually a glass door, it is glass walls, and sometimes it's a glass floor as well. You know, the barriers come at you from every direction. But do you think that we've made any progress there? Do you think that the glass ceiling is being broken?
Look, I think you're right in the sense that maybe it's a glass room. I definitely agree with you on that sentiment, but I think sometimes we also need to look at the broader picture. A more diverse woman actually in that room to get the opportunity to break those glass doors, ceilings, walls. And I think that's something that I often reflect on, because it's time to actually start bringing more diverse women who have been left out of that opportunity to break those glass ceilings, to be a part of that movement. Unfortunately, upon my reflection, I think that the gender equality advocacy space has been exclusive, but I definitely do see quite a bit of progress over the past couple of years. We're slowly starting to have those important discussions about inclusivity and diversity. I think both of which are two puzzle pieces that connect into one. And I think that those conversations are absolutely important to slowly shift that trajectory of creating more opportunities for diversity of women who haven't been a part of that revolution. So the fact that we are having those conversations is absolutely important. That's the first step to creating room. I think it does quite get frustrating when you are consistently having those conversations, but you're seeing limited change. However, I think you're right. You can't necessarily open that glass door in one night. It is going to take quite a while. And I think that I would love to be on Earth when we stop having these conversations about opening that door, breaking those glass ceilings. Because you know what? I'm sure, just like yourself, we don't want to be having these webinars about what we can do to create change and create more opportunities. I want there to be more opportunity. I want us to get to that point where we stop having these conversations that continuously seem to be, swept under the rug, or make that minuscule chip in the door that we are trying to break. Look, I think opportunities are slowly being created, and mentorship is definitely a big part of it. You spoke about role models, and I think with the evolution of slowly seeing more women of color, more diversity within those role models, we're slowly creating more opportunities as well for more diversities to consistently see themselves reflected in the highest level of leadership and governance.
Yeah, I think that sort of, I think people don't often get the complexities that, as women of color, we come from different countries, we, have different experiences. And yet on one level, just by skin tone, we might look very similar. And what I find is that I'm expected to be the voice of all Black women. And I find that very challenging. And I said, no, I have my own experiences and my own culture and heritage that has informed me, but we cannot be treated like a homogenous group. So although we're, looking at gender equality, alongside that is also the cultural diversity of women of color that they bring. And some of those hurdles can come from within our own cultures as well. So we're sort of battling with those and trying to overcome those, but also in a predominantly white-led sort of world as well. And I mean, I do know that some women have struggled very, very hard to get to where they are, and all their energies have been spent on carving out that space or that opportunity for them. That some of them are just exhausted by that and take up all their energies by just protecting that space for themselves, that they don't have the time to actually look behind them or look forward. So I suppose sort of like, I'd be interested, again, sort of like a message for the audience is that, you know, although we are campaigners, we are outspoken, we both have platforms, that actually we are women, and we also have families, we also have our health and well-being, our mental capacities, our, you know, just as rounded human beings, there is a limit. So from that point of view, the message is the more that join the voices, you know, not only amplifying, talking more loudly, but also listening more loudly as well. I think that that is important. So perhaps that's something that could be discussed, is how do people listen more loudly instead of just being passive recipients of, you know, being entertained by the two of us speaking together. But I would challenge people, what are you going to take away from this? What behaviors are you going to change? Because we all have a role to play in that, don't we? In that sense. So I suppose sort of like we've talked already a little bit about what different generations can learn from each other. Is there anything else that you can reflect on that with us speaking over the last few minutes and raising some other points about diversity within diversity, and being aware of cultural and historical heritage as well as the future?
Yeah, look, I think you touched on some great points there. And I think, unfortunately, especially as women, and I think this probably affects us quite a bit more as women of color, but there is this perception that there can only be one of us in spaces that hold room for women of color or holds room for women in general. Being a profound and prominent Muslim woman of color in Australia, a young Muslim woman of color, I've often, you know, faced that challenge of recognizing that I am not the voice of young women of color. I'm not the voice of Muslim young women of color. I need to consistently create room for women of color to share their own stories on their own means. And I think I'm often, like yourself, expected to take this role where I represent an entire demographic. I am not that representation that many organizations, many media corporations look for. I can't speak on behalf of an entire religion or entire culture. And I think that we consistently need to abolish this concept that, number one, that there isn't enough room for every single one of us. But number two, that we are the representation of an entire demographic. Both notions have been completely harmful to my advocacy as well. I remember in my early years of my advocacy, I definitely did hold the concept that I am quite embarrassed of today, that I do represent voices that aren't being amplified by the media. And I think it's only been over the last couple of years that I've slowly started to realize that instead of speaking up and speaking loudly and representing those voices that aren't being told, I need to create that room for those voices to tell their own stories as well. Because I'm not that representation, and I'm taking up space on my own count. And I am doing exactly what I have been advocating for, to create space, to create room for women like myself. But look, I think it's completely selfish. And I think many of us do often battle with that concept of, do I take up space or do I pass on an opportunity? And especially as women of color, where there aren't many opportunities, they're very scarce. What do you do in that position? And I am slowly starting to, you know, find my own path and my own trajectory on what to do when opportunities do come up. But it's quite funny because when I do reflect on other women, such as white women within Australia, speaking to many feminists, I often find that many of them don't really struggle with this concept. So that imposter syndrome element also ties into my advocacy work as well, which is quite, you know, difficult as a young woman navigating my way from, number one, avoiding doxing online, but number two, creating space.
I do know what you mean. Your question is quite a good one about, do you use that space to the best of your ability, or do you sort of vacate it occasionally? My advice would be that actually there is space for both, and nothing bad happens, actually. You don't miss out. You may have sort of missed out on that particular platform for that 30 minutes, but what you have done is amplifies somebody else's voice for that 30 minutes. And what it also does is that it allows you to sort of recalibrate for your next challenge as well. So that's what I found, but I've learned that the hard way, I have to say, is to do that. It builds more camaraderie, and it brings that intersectionality together as well. See, when I first got elected, obviously it was headline news, the big breakthrough had happened, and we got great iconic pictures with the First Minister, and it was all very it was great. I did find it rather overwhelming, I have to say. Being a teacher for 30 years and having campaigned extensively on education issues and equality issues, none of that was important. It was just the headline, first women of colour. And I was inundated with media requests, and it was all about the same thing. And what was interesting was that nobody was very interested in the fact that I had been elected for a 5-year term, and what was my opinion on education policy? What was my opinion on housing policy? And housing is a huge issue in the constituency that I live in. My opinions on climate change, for instance, and the fact that we were going to be hosting COP26 in Glasgow in my constituency, were somehow totally irrelevant. And I made the very, very difficult decision not to give any interviews after the immediate aftermath of my election, unless it was about policy issues. And you won't be surprised to know that there were no media inquiries asking for me to speak on anything else, which was quite interesting. I mean, that's changed now. Now, I suppose I'm 10 months into the job, and I am getting other, sort of opportunities to speak on that. But it does give you an example of how you get pigeonholed. And although on the one hand, people love a human interest story, it is then moving beyond that and looking at us as women of colour with expertise in policy areas, because we are the fabric, part of the fabric of society. And housing, immigration, climate change, transport policy, those are very important points for us. And actually, a lot of those impact ethnic minority communities quite severely. There are additional sort of barriers that we have in that. I would be interested to hear your view on that. Is that the same sort of thing that happens in Australia? Black women get asked to talk about sort of the obvious sort of issues, or are they more involved in mainstream policy affecting that?
Yeah, look, I think exact same thing happens here. And unfortunately, it's quite disappointing, and it does get very tedious. I think reflecting on my own, media opportunities that I've received, I was slowly thinking about it whilst you were talking about your own experience. And I think I don't have one article that doesn't tie in my cultural diversity. And that growing up, I often felt alienated. I often felt like I wasn't a woman. I felt like me being a Muslim woman was completely bizarre for the Australian community. I faced so much discrimination. I had my hijab ripped off numerous times. My religion was completely discriminated by so many people in my life. And I don't even think I've ever slowly, felt like I belonged to the woman in our fight for gender equality. I've almost felt like an alien half the time. And growing up and having a space in places of advocacy like gender equality, I think I've slowly started to find my own voice and acknowledge my own identity. But I think that upon reflection, and I think it's quite crazy because this is probably the first time that's happened to me, in this webinar, I've slowly started to realize that my identity often is the only reason I'm a part of a space. It's not my expertise, it's not my voice, it's not my passion, it's my identity. It's the fact that I wear a hijab, it's the fact that I'm a woman of color. And it definitely is quite disappointing, because I know I've struggled in places of employment, of opportunity, of receiving awards or scholarships, where I often question whether I'm an appropriate candidate of such, or whether it's because of my identity. And you know, that element does really affect you, and I think that it does go a very long way in, you know, tearing your self-esteem as well. Am I really here because I am a strong advocate, or am I here because of my identity, because of the way that I look?
I've sort of, you know, on reflection, I think that we hold multiple identities, but unfortunately, we are seen through people's single vision lenses. And that's the unfortunate thing, is that other people cannot process that we have multiple identities that are informed by our experiences, our culture, our color, our gender, you know, all of those things come into it. And it does make, and aren't we good at switching between all of those, because they actually make up us as whole women, and I get a lot of confidence from that. But for a period of time, because of the pigeonholes, and people find it difficult to put me in a pigeonhole, because at times I wear Western clothes, what are perceived as Western clothes. Other times I wear a shalwar kameez, and I mix between the two. And I never thought it was a thing, but now that because it's part of me, both aspects are part of me. And at the Parliament, what's interesting was that when I wore shalwar kameez there, people did comment on it as if I was wearing a sort of fancy dress of some sort, whereas actually it was just work clothes. You know, it was a work plain shalwar kameez sort of outfit that I was wearing. But what I did notice was that young people who watch the parliamentary debates and things, they were noticing that it was becoming normalized, that they were seeing somebody in Parliament who wasn't making a big deal out of it, was just standing up, making a speech, wearing shalwar kameez, reflecting a part of their identity, and it was normalized. It wasn't even referred to. So I deliberately now make sure that I wear, you know, sort of like, well, I did anyway, but I pursue that aim of exposing people to the multiple identities and making sure that they're familiar and they're okay with it. But hey, you know, if they're not, I am in that sense. So you know, the generations working together have sort of brought us together, and this is just wonderful to have this chat with you. I'm learning so much from your perspectives here. What can generations working together do to encourage more intergenerational dialogue on the topic of gender equality? Is there, I mean, this is a fantastic thing, but what else could they do? Let's put some pressure on them.
Yeah, look, I've worked in the highest level of governance, and I can tell you that funding, no doubt the biggest issue that young people face in continuing their advocacy on a long-term level. If we want to create that long-term change, which gender equality is all about. Gender equality isn't a short-term goal, it's a long-term change, and it's going to require a lot of commitment. And that funding element is often missing, especially within youth-led advocacy and youth-led movements. I think that there fundamentally needs to be some sort of long-term strategy and approach towards creating access to funding, but also access to opportunity and upskilling for young people to continue their advocacy on the grassroots levels. Upon working at an international level, I found that grassroots advocacy fundamentally will be the leading and driving momentum to creating that gender equality advocacy that we are after. And I think that it is fundamental to explore how international organizations and major organizations that have so much power and influence can collectively work with grassroots organizations that are led by underrepresented minorities and constituents to continue that advocacy on a long-term basis. So for me, I know I've struggled with funding. I know I've struggled with access to opportunity, and especially upskilling. You can't just provide young people with opportunities if you're not upskilling them to absolutely exploit that opportunity. And I'm going to use the big E word. We got to exploit that opportunity, because if we do not exploit that opportunity will go to waste. So I think both go hand in hand with each other, and we need to explore how we can work with these grassroots advocates to create that change together.
I think what I would add to that is my challenge would be the tracking of that, because what I'm finding is that there are lots of initiatives that happen, lots of spaces that are opened up, but they still seem to be one-off opportunities or a series of events that is based around a theme. But then what is happening is that there's no tracking of that. And I certainly, as a backbencher in the Scottish Parliament, it's one of the questions that I always ask is, how are you tracking that progress? What are the measurable outcomes that you're achieving here? What does success look like? Because sometimes what I do find, and this is a wee bit of cynicism that creeps into me, is that there are lots of saviours around, and they sort of create opportunities, create spaces. It makes them feel good and it's job done. And governments can do that as well. When you're challenged on sort of race equality or gender equality, it's, oh, well, we've got this policy, we've got that policy. But what happens next? It's the execution of that policy. How does that policy actually filter down? What is the impact of it? What is the change in people's life experiences? And that can be, the qualitative and the quantitative data needs to be collected. And then I think that would help to maybe secure that funding a little bit more as well, because that leads into accountability. Maybe, that is my challenge to actually any organization, but also, generations working together, I'm sure, are, doing their absolute part in that, but we can always push people further. So as we come towards the end of this chat, we've explored so many themes, but we can't get away from the ageism one. We in Scotland at the moment have local authority elections coming up, and we've had a number of candidates that are quite youthful. And they've been selected, and there's been a bit of a backlash in the press about the lack of life experience. And the fact that they've not had a real job or, done anything, and how do they think that they can be elected representatives? Now, I have my views about that. I'd be interested to hear what your views are on that, Zara.
Yeah, look, I think especially as a young woman, I have faced my fair share of scrutiny. I have faced my fair share of questions, and have definitely faced with that opposing element of imposter syndrome. So it is quite a challenge for myself. At the end of last year, I did actually run for my president of my university, and I faced quite a lot of harsh criticism, not only for my age, but also for my identity as a Muslim woman. I was consistently branded as a angry Muslim young advocate who is trying so hard to be a feminist. And, it does definitely get to you on a mental note, but I think that it needs to be done. And if we're going to talk about how change happens, you got to start having that slow representation. And I think that you're a clear testament of that. You embody and you absolutely epitomize what will slowly happen in terms of representation over time. And until we consistently start to normalize and change the trajectory of what a diverse level of leadership and governance looks like, we can't, stop and cease the opportunities that we have to be a part of that trajectory of change as well. And I think that if I'm going to cop it for the future generations, then so be it, as long as we're slowly working together to create that change. if not me, who else? And I consistently ask myself that. And I consistently always remind myself that, you know, there has to be someone. This is the way that change is going to happen. Dialogue, storytelling, and, you know, may as well be about me.
Absolutely. And it should be absolutely about yourself. I'm going to reframe what you were maybe perceived or labeled as into a young, intelligent, articulate advocate for intersectionality on equality. Actually, that's how I see you as. So that's the other way of looking at it. And that's the way I will look at it. Ageism, it's a funny thing, especially in sort of represented positions and elected positions. It's not something that men suffer from, is it? I mean, if you look at the average age of parliamentarians, as well as the colour and the gender, then it is predominantly dominated by white elder men. And I suppose the systems that certainly here, they were created by those people. So the rules were created by them, not for the likes of me, I suppose. So it's even harder to break through that. From my point of view, I just think that, you know, the intersectionality bit is just so important to emphasize. So we're looking at gender equality, we're looking at race coming into that, and then also age coming into that as well. And we've already talked a lot about how bringing all of those things together, I think that is the volcano that erupts into something that is incredibly positive. And, you know, that lava of hope can encompass everything and sort of, you know, crack the surfaces that it covers, but then sort of reinvigorate and reignite a different way of working, that synergy that can happen. I mean, I certainly enjoy, you know, as an educationalist, I'm quite used to sort of communicating with and working alongside young people. I get a lot of drive and energy, but I also get pushed by them. I get asked difficult questions. You know, somebody like Greta Thunberg, who, you know, sort of annoys so many people. And I think, well, quite right, because actually without annoying people, how do you break that chain? You know, how do you get people to think differently? It's not by behaving well. It is by asking the difficult questions. And whereas somebody like me who can get very tired and sometimes lose that inspiration, and then to get buoyed up and get challenged, I think quite right, you know, in that sense. But I'm also finding that younger women are coming to me and they are listening to and valuing my experiences and learning from maybe the rocky roads and the paths of, you know, I can say, don't do that. You know, I tried that, it didn't work. And hopefully I'm giving them a few shortcuts so that we don't, you know, hopefully we can achieve gender equality a lot sooner than what the stats are showing us. But I have no doubt that, you know, people like yourself and me, I'll put myself in there as well. It may as well be about the both of us. I'm sure that we can, you know, keep going. Zara, it's been absolutely wonderful to speak to you. And I hope that the people who are listening and watching, it's given them a lot of food for thought and inspired some questions and how they're going to change their behaviours and change their views and do things differently. I know there are things that I've learned from you that will make me think differently. So have you got something to say to the audiences as a farewell message?
Yeah, look, I just want to push on the message that everyone listening should absolutely take up space wherever you go and share your story. But also remember that not everyone is deserving to hear your story. Recognize that your voice is a part of that revolution and we all share our part in creating the movement for gender equality and creating that room for every single one of us to be a part of that revolution. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. I really, really do appreciate it. And I think that you are an absolutely major inspiration for so many young women of color like myself. So, so much love from Australia to you, and hopefully together we will build a future that is representative of every single intersectional voice across the world.
Thank you, Zara, and it is absolutely reciprocated from Scotland and sunny Glasgow here as well. Sending you much love on this International Women's Day on building gender equality for sustainability. And that's what it's all about. It's not just one-off wee pockets of success, but it's about building that sustainability to the benefit of all of us. And I would like to, on behalf of both of us, I'd like to thank Generations Working Together for bringing us together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a pleasure listening to both of you, and I'm sure our audience is going to absolutely love it. So interesting. Kaukab, Zara, thank you so much. And yeah, we'll finish it there, but I'm sure Kate will be in touch.
Okay, I hope that was you, Zara. It was so lovely to meet you. I'd love to sort of like, you know, you've got my contact details, so please do keep in touch. And if there is anything that I can help with, I'd be delighted. And, you know, if you come over, I would be more than happy to welcome you to the Scottish Parliament and, you know, sort of show you the chamber and do the VIP tour. So you would be more than welcome to do that at any time.
Yeah. And
Thank you so much. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and I'm sure Kate will be in touch, because it would be really great to keep in touch with you to see if there's more that we can actually do. Can you actually hear me?
Yeah,
you can.
Yeah.
So that there is, you know, so that this is a dialogue that we want to continue.
Yeah.
So yeah, we will definitely be in touch. Kate will be in touch. But thank you very much, the two of you, for today. Thank you.
That's brilliant.